take a quick step back here. It was actually, from the NREL side, it was fairly interesting to write this report because it's highly renewable energy focused, I think, in terms of the framing. And despite being from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, my analysis center is really quite focused on, taking a very holistic approach to the power sector. So a lot of this stuff, some of the language that we had to use in the report made me a little bit uncomfortable just because it's very, very renewable focused and not thinking more holistically about the power sector. But generally speaking, these are what we call the pillars of the policy framework phase and for renewable energy. But I would argue with a couple of language changes in here, these are perhaps the pillars for all low carbon future power systems. So just to start, bankability. So the role of policy should be to maintain the bankability of new investments, and perhaps even existing investments that are needed to, perhaps on the flexibility side to enable these new investments to occur. We certainly need to make sure that the grid is sufficiently flexible and reliable to incorporate renewable energy, and then that's linked very carefully back to bankability because theoretically we know how to, technically we know how to do this, but how do you make the money work? How do you make sure that people are being paid fairly and that the investment signals are right so that you're getting the flexibility resources that you need? And then finally, with the goal of sustained long-term build up and deployment of renewable energy, we found that having some sort of a long-term vision for the sector can be very important. And we group certain things under here. I'll talk about it a little bit more later. But addressing the existing conventional fleet. This is not just renewable energy targets and what we want to do there, but it's dealing with the system as a whole and the direction that we want to take it. So bankability, we don't have to spend a whole bunch of time here. I think we kind of know what a project is if it's bankable. It's important to point out, I guess so just in terms of being really specific with language, when I talk about a healthy renewable energy market, for me that means high social acceptance, broad political support, competitively priced capital, and obviously projects that are being invested in by a wide range of different investors. That's actually an important point that we explore in the paper a bit, is that there really is a lot of heterogeneity in terms of the types of investors that could potentially get into investing in renewable technologies. They all have different risk profiles, access to capital, et cetera. And we have found, just in reviewing a lot of experiences around the world, that having a diverse group there actually is really quite key for deployment in the long term. So we talk about wholesale markets as well, but because we're in South Africa, I wanted to talk about bankability in single buyer markets. One of the trends we saw certainly is that long-term PPAs that are government-backed in some capacity, either government-backed or there's some sort of guarantee behind them, or you have a highly credit-worthy off-taker, that tends to be quite necessary. I will say that on the wholesale market side, at least in the US, most of the transactions that are going through the wholesale markets, they're all just reflective of long-term contracts. I mean, I think it's 80–90%. However, we are seeing some really interesting cases. So for instance, in Texas, we are seeing we're seeing wind projects getting built without any power purchase agreement whatsoever. They are participating in a spot market, and then interestingly, they have a very particularly deep and liquid financial products market, so they can buy all sorts of different hedges hedging products that reduce their risk a little bit, and they're getting payback periods, on the order of 6–7 years for these wind projects, and making quite a bit of money without a power purchase agreement whatsoever. But yeah, so. As well, in terms of procurement processes, so I think one of the big trends that we're seeing right now is that in the past procurement processes, South Africa certainly being one of them, they incentivize developers to go after the lowest cost resource possible, the most profitable investment for their individual, for themselves. And what we're seeing is different strategies to shift investors, locationally to invest in areas that are actually better for the system as a whole. Certainly some interesting stuff in Mexico and otherwise. And then on the PPA design side, I have a slide on this later, so I think I'll leave it. Okay, so flexibility, the second pillar. I like to group flexibility into two different areas: physical flexibility and institutional. Physical is really what is technically possible for the grid. So what are the ramp rates that are available for your conventional fleet? What kind of demand response resources do you have? Are there flexible AC transmission strategies that you can put into place? On the institutional side, what we find a lot of time is that there are ways that power systems are operated, which if they were operated differently, they could be more flexible. So an example of that might be if Medupi has a 3,000 hour minimum that it needs to generate every year, and you could do a study where you said, all right, well, what would the value be to the broader system if Medupi could go down to 1,000 hours a year and you had that extra ramping time. Also, in terms of thinking about flexibility, we have a whole paper on this that we wrote with colleagues from IEA actually sometime in the last few years, and we talk about really very broadly all of the different sources of flexibility that exist. This paper really is more targeted towards policymakers, and I won't name names, but policymakers who make statements like, well, we can't have wind and solar in any more than 5% of our time because we don't have storage. We need to have storage, and so this whole paper, it's called Flexibility in 21st Century Power Systems. It sort of goes through very policymaker focused and says, hey, here are the broad areas where flexibility is possible: load, services from the variable renewable generators themselves, obviously conventional generation, transmission system, yes, storage, sure, but then importantly system operation. If you can get better at renewable energy forecasting, if you can reduce your gate closure times for the system operator, there's all sorts of things that don't necessarily cost a lot of money, but they do they take a lot of politicking maybe to get done. Okay, so quickly, only because I have a few minutes left, Debbie Liu was very kind to talk about Xcel Energy earlier, so I can skip a lot of the background. But this is my utility, Debbie and Tim's utility back in Colorado. It's a 7 gigawatt system, about half coal. They're regularly experiencing hourly penetrations of 60% or more wind energy, and they are allowing wind to actually provide inertial response and load following and all sorts of things to their grid. One of the reasons that they're doing this is because they're quite loosely connected. They're primarily responsible for self-balancing, and they have a ton of wind on their system, so they need to come up with some interesting strategies.